cozy book event. All right, we've got a pretty good number. It's 2 minutes. People can keep rolling in, but I'm going to go ahead and read our introduction and the rules, introduce Madhav in the book, and then we'll get on with it. Okay. So hi, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's event. My name is Bree, and I am the Assistant Events Director at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Mass. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. And if this is your first time joining us, welcome. We're very happy to have you join our community this afternoon. We appreciate your support of the author and an independent bookstore through your purchase and attendance. As I said, the chat and question box are open down at the bottom of Zoom. If you're going to use the chat, just make sure to set it to all attendees and panelists so that everyone can see. And if you're going to ask questions, please do use the Q&A because if they're in the chat, they can be hard to keep track of. I would also like to say that Brookline Booksmith has a strict policy against abusive behavior and language, and at our discretion, any attendee can be removed from an event for partaking in such behavior. So, the man of the hour, Madhav Misra, was educated at St. Stephen's College, Delhi, and Columbia University, New York. He has lived and worked in London, Tehran, New York City, and San Francisco. His wife and he now divide their time between California, Hawaii, and the Himalayan foothills. Labyrinth of the Wind is his first novel, which, of course, we're celebrating today, and is a suspenseful work of historical fiction set in Tehran, Delhi, and several other European hotspots. The novel focuses on love and consequences at a time of political upheaval, when the author lived and worked in Iran. Declassified documents confirmed the Iranian government's efforts at this time to procure uranium. The author was evacuated from Tehran on Christmas Day, 1978, shortly before the fall of the Pahlavi dynasty. It is my pleasure to have him with us here today, and without further ado, Madhav will begin the event with a reading from the book. I'll be right back.
Thank you, Bree. I think I'll read some excerpts from Chapter 1 of Labyrinth of the Wind, and it starts in Tehran, Iran. It's October 1977. Some succeed in grabbing the world by the scruff of its neck. His had been an insecure grip, but on this morning he felt hopeful. Ayan Pathak rested his weight on the rooftop railing of the apartment he rented in Khanum Mohsen's high country Tehran villa and looked north, away from the unmade limiting city that meandered towards the great salt desert. The Alborz, just emerging from silhouette, rose steeply above him. Hints of Gabby's perfume wafted up from his body, sending a frisson of excitement through him, reminding him of last night. All day should start like this. The rumble of traffic cut through the mulberry and cedar trees defending the villa from the parkway. Ayan hurried back inside. His 45-minute commute to the Iran Power factory could turn into a 2-hour nightmare if he lingered. He walked softly into the bedroom where Gabby still slept, pulled the covers over her legs, and kissed the top of her head. She smiled and reached out for him, then fell back on her pillow, recovering from the multiple flights on yesterday's dreaded Shiraz Everywhere assignment. Ayan placed her pilot's cap on the chest of drawers, hung her Iran Air uniform in the closet, and made room in the kelvinator for the remnants of the champagne she brought. From the flight deck, pilot's perks. 10 minutes later, he was dressed and moving briskly down the circular stone staircase that led to the carport. His driver, Hamid, reversed out of the villa and navigated the series of one-way streets as they entered the depressing gray-white sprawl of downtown Tehran. He expertly avoided the increasing mayhem till they reached Pahlavi Avenue. Suddenly, Hamid braked hard. They had run into traffic at the merge onto the parkway and almost hit the car ahead. Ayan rolled down the window and heard yelling as Hamid got out to investigate the gridlock. The voices morphed into rhythmic chants that made Ayan uneasy, bringing back memories of being in the midst of a column of Shia mourners flogging their backs during Muharram. He was in a place he didn't belong. Frenzied demonstrators began to run past the Pekan shouting, Marg Bar Shah, Marg Bar Amrika. One of them lagged, as if caught on the stretched edge of a rubber band pulling him back to his pursuers. He was just a boy, 16 at most, a Persian Adonis with delicate features and a tentative beard. And as he sprinted past the Iran Park car, looking back anxiously at the men giving chase, a crack in the treacherous road felled him. Two men in track jackets and jeans threw themselves on the teenager and handcuffed him. One dug his knee into the boy's spine and repeatedly slammed his captive's face into the asphalt, while the other kicked him mercilessly. The boy's mouth and forehead spurted blood. A kick caught his jaw and sent a shower of teeth and saliva onto the road. A dark, wet patch spread out from his groin down to the end of his jeans and formed a pool by his sneakers. Ahead, the shouting stopped. Engines revved and tires squealed as the protesters sped off. The impatient traffic began to move around the brutal tableau. Ayan's fists clenched. He pushed open the door and yelled, "Stop!" The man who had been kicking the boy pulled out a pistol. Hamid reappeared and pulled Ayan back towards the Pekan. No, Ayan Aga, Hamid said as Ayan resisted. Savak, please go back in the car, they will kill us too. The driver put his hands together and bowed to the approaching man. Excuse us, please forgive us, Hamid said. This Aga works for the Shah, Iran Par. He's a foreigner, he doesn't understand. The man pointed his gun at Hamid and then at Ayan, then at Hamid again. Hamid dropped to his knees and continued pleading and pointing to the Iran Par logo on the Pekan as the man brought the gun to his forehead. Cars behind them honked. The boy on the ground stirred. The Savak man holding him down called to his companion. The agent with the gun waved Hamid off contemptuously. He swaggered back, lifted the barrel of his pistol, and brought it down on the boy's head with immense force. Bree, I think I'll stop there and come back to you for our discussion.
Thank you so much. That was very suspenseful, and I'm very excited to discuss your characters and the rest of the book. How much of the novel is autobiographical?
Well, to begin with, I have to say that this is a work of fiction. But I was in Tehran at this time. I did have a job in the energy complex, and the events followed the timeline. The story follows the timeline of historical events. So there was a place, the places I mentioned, all of them exist. There was this Sybaritic club called the Key Club, the tennis club that people hung out at, the skiing, the après skiing festivities, the water skiing, the weekends in the Caspian, and all the characters existed in terms of people who were actually around on the scene. You could observe them in the scene in Tehran at the time. So it's fiction, but it is informed by my experience at that time.
Mm-hmm. So when you're writing in that way, historical fiction, but also from your own experiences, how much of the plot is historical invention?
Well, the plot really, again, I'll say that the Shah has been on record as wanting nuclear weapons. In Le Monde, he gave an interview to Le Monde saying, one day sooner than people think, Iran will be in possession of a nuclear bomb. And his court minister in his journals mentioned many times that the Shah was determined to have a nuclear bomb. And declassified documents from that time from the US defense and energy departments showed that all the worries and concerns we have about Iran today and their nuclear program existed at the time. They were very worried about the 23,000 megawatt nuclear energy program that the Shah was embarked on, because the byproduct of that, the processing of the nuclear fuel, they felt could produce 600 atomic bombs every year. And the Shah went out of his way to support this atomic energy organization of Iran. They had the highest paid people. He was funding MIT on research, looking for uranium all over the world. And there was this company, Nufcor SA, the Nuclear Fuels Corporation of South Africa, which was formed by a consortium of gold mining companies to sell the uranium that they produce as a byproduct of gold mining. And that's on record as being the only known source of the uranium yellowcake Iran has even today. And the purchase occurred at that time. So to that extent, that is not invention. I would say that all the events in terms of the revolution, the killing of Khomeini's son, which actually happened the day before the novel starts, and the novel actually starts, the protests that I profiled are in response to the killing of Khomeini's son, the first real protest of the Iranian Revolution. And all the events I mentioned in terms of the revolution actually occurred. Mm. Now, having said that, the actions of specific people, their motivations, the characters, all that's sort of invention. I don't know if that answers your question, Bree, or is that?
No, it absolutely does. But it does make me wonder where in the timeline of the revolution your evacuation from Tehran was, and in the timeline of the novel as well, if you existed in the novel world and vice versa.
Well, personally, I arrived in '76 in Tehran and was left on evacuation flight on Christmas Day, 1978, which was just 3 weeks before the Shah fled. So we were under a curfew from September of 1978. So so does that give you a sense? So I was there during the heyday of the westernized lifestyle of the expatriates under the Shah, and then also saw the evolution develop around me, and then scrambled to get out and found it really hard to get out and find flights out of Iran. And I'll tell you, I was shared an apartment with several Europeans and an American, and I was the only one who could go out towards the end of the stay there and not get beaten up. Wow. As a born person. So everybody was assumed to be American at that time, and there were mobs around the streets of Tehran. There was gunfire at night. So I was there so does that give you a sense? I mean, it's a long answer, but it gives you a sense that I left just barely before the Shah had to leave.
Yep, and you saw the revolution kind of grow and evolve around you until suddenly you're in a position where it's unsafe to leave your apartment and you need to be evacuated.
Right.
Yep. So how did you conceive your principal characters?
Well, this comes back to, I've been wanting to write several stories. Stories about the Indian, and give voice to the Indian who really developed around the early 70s and was able to escape the shackles of the partition of India, the Great Depression, which had a major impact on India and on the colonial rule. And that had produced a very conservative mindset in the parents and influencers. For most young people used to choose safe professions and settle down early. But around the time that I graduated in the early 70s, there was a cohort of Indians that had struck out with a view of themselves and of their possibilities, more inspired by America than of England. And I wanted to give voice to that story. And as I traveled around the world, I met many people from many different countries who were part of what I like to call the global English-speaking nation of the mind, who basically for the first time, there were people who were not American, and not European, who could imagine doing whatever they set their hearts to. And they basically were inspired by some idea of America. Different people, whether it was Dylan, Joplin, Martin Luther King, etc. And there was this reverberation from the Vietnam protests, which had sort of died down and been effective in the United States, but they were reverberating around the world in the form of revolution, in the form of uprisings, urban guerrillas, rural guerrillas. There was a lot of social change happening at that time. So I wanted to capture that Indian voice, this cohort, and also being distinctively Indian, but part of this cohort, revolution. And I was not looking for the sybaritic lifestyle I found in Tehran. Neither was I looking to be part of a revolution, but that had a big impact on me. I wanted to write about that. And I wanted to write about the compromises, tensions, just corporate life that I had experienced at various levels. And finally, I come from a large family. We have an oral tradition, and people getting old. I wanted to preserve the stories that I'd heard and preserve lives that I really admired in some shape or form. And as a result, when I sat down to write, all of these thoughts came to my head. And so the characters were shaped. Basically I went to Stanford's writer's studio and attended a lot of their workshops. And as I was writing different stories through the guidance of some wonderful people, Nancy Packer, Lynn Stegner, a whole bunch of wonderful authors who taught there, the shape of a novel emerged. And the shape of the characters emerged, together with also, I must mention, Tom Parker, who gave me wonderful editorial advice on the shaping of the characters. Also, I was introduced to Tom Parker by Nancy Packer. So through this, the characters emerged, and so you have this Ayan who thinks he's doing something heroic, and he's following the Indian tradition of stages of life, but he's actually a very flawed character and viewed by many people as being selfish and greedy, but he thinks he's just being American. That's his view. There's his conscience then is Gabby, this Gabby who represents really the revolutionary. But, I mentioned the idea of revolution I wanted to bring out, and she's a supporter of the Baader-Meinhof revolution, but she's also a supporter of the underdog. Then there's this character Hamid, who is the face of the revolution, who doesn't pull Ayan, or doesn't ask Ayan to do anything, but pulls him in by his own commitment and the generosity of his family. And so these are the three principal characters that developed. And then there's a whole range of ancillary characters that, and by the way, the only real characters are the parents, the driver Hamid, and the Savak colonel. Those are real people. Everybody else is sort of observed, people I observed around the scene in Tehran.
I wonder if you could speak a little bit to your portrayal of thoughtful and well-rounded female characters.
Well, I grew up, my mother was very real in this novel as Ma. She was a real matriarch and a doctor at a time when you were not supposed to be a doctor in India, and the oldest of a large family. And I grew up with an older sister. And so I've always been surrounded by strong aunts, and I've always been comfortable with strong women, and of course my wife and two daughters are extremely strong women. So people have remarked I didn't set out to portray rounded, strong women. I just portrayed characters who happen to be women, and I'm glad that people think that the comments many people think that the women are the strongest characters in the book, and I'm happy about that.
So your characters are faced with some really hard and consequential choices. Could you give us some insight into what makes them tick and how they can make those choices?
Sure. So Ayan, his biggest choice was, when, and I don't want to give away too much of the plot, but he's presented with a situation where it's a fait accompli. If he does what his boss asks him to do, and his boss is a very sort of devious central casting CEO, suave, sophisticated, who plays with everybody's motivations and manipulates them for the good of the corporation and himself and his country. So Ayan is just somebody a puppet that he has to manipulate, and he gets a sense that Ayan's driven by this need to make more money, and Ayan is motivated by need to make more money from a need to become independent and not be this cap in hand immigrant, but to be able to pursue the imagined life. And other people can take whatever view, but that's the view that I wrote from. And then he's stuck, and he's given a choice. Either he helps the program, the nuclear program that is presented to him, or he's out of a job. And in Iran, if you were out of a job, you had to leave the next day. Your work permit was linked to your job. And so he really was not interested in, there was a huge recession in Europe and America. He was not quite ready to go back home. He really didn't want to be out on his ear. And then he was promised, if you did this, you would make an untold amount of money. And initially the huge amount of money did not really it was not his motivation. He thought he would just play along and go along. And so he made this decision thinking, in his mind, Indira Gandhi had just tested a nuclear bomb, which had come from a very bad experience she had with Nixon and Kissinger. And by the way, if people want to read the transcripts that have been declassified between Nixon and Kissinger during the time of the liberation of Bangladesh, they use such foul language about Indira Gandhi because Nixon was in particularly interested in just this bridge to China, and he didn't want anything to do with Bangladesh. Cut a long story short, he sent the 7th Fleet in to attack India and stop India from liberating Bangladesh. And because of a treaty that Indira Gandhi had signed with Brezhnev, there was a friendship treaty that they would respond, and Brezhnev sent nuclear submarines to tail the USS Enterprise, which promptly left. And that had a lasting impression on Indira Gandhi, and so she tested this nuclear bomb. And it made everybody take India seriously, and the Shah of Iran was determined then. He said, if she can have one, I'm going to have one. And Ayan was thinking, well, maybe this is the post-colonial way of thinking. It's why should it be kind of nuclear apartheid? Why should one country decide? It's not that he wanted the world to have nuclear weapons, but he justified to himself. So he thought through the process that way. Gabby, basically, her decisions were really sort of to leave and focus on Barbara Meinhof. She was very well established, a pilot, but here she was risking all for really getting rid of the remnants of Nazism in Germany. And the fact that women, till Barbara Meinhof showed up, were really constrained to the kitchen, the church, and children. And Barbara Meinhof had this great appeal for women because Meinhof was a woman. And it was one of the only organizations in Germany at that time where women were equal partners. In fact, the stronger partner. And so she had that, and she also wanted to take care of her mother. So she had that mentality. And then Hamid, the third character, he is desperately poor. 5 of them live in a room. And, he knew how much money was flowing into Iran. None of it was coming to him. A deeply religious man, he was influenced by his imam, and they didn't quite like the Western lifestyle, the giving women the right to vote, reducing the power of the mullahs in family courts, etc. Didn't really, a lot of the mullahs came from landowning families who the Shah really hurt through his white revolution. So the mullahs kept telling the people that the Shah is bad. Hamid experienced the fact that he was poor and obviously the Shah was corrupt. And Ayatollah's Khomeinis were hugely influential. The tapes coming in from Najaf were very, very charismatic and powerful. So, you know, he was driven by a need to improve his life and the religious need to follow the Shia way. So this gives you a sense of the three motivations, and sort of they come together through choice and circumstance. There's many others, but I don't think, you know, we don't have the time, Bree, but the people will have to, at some other time, we can talk about the motivations of Nadir and Luke, the banker in Geneva, and Chip de Groot, the South African broker, and a whole variety of the supporting cast.
I wish we did have time, honestly, but people will have to find out when they read the book, right? So for me, a strong point in a novel's favor, you can tell it's a really well-crafted novel, when in addition to these really well fleshed out and believable characters, is you have well fleshed out and believable settings. And your descriptions of settings are so vivid. Tehran, London, Delhi, Geneva, West Berlin, Munich. How did you choose those settings, and how did they become characters in their own right?
That's it. That's interesting. You know, I actually either lived or worked in most of the places. And in the case, so West Berlin, I actually traveled there through Checkpoint Charlie. You know, and sorry, I went to West Berlin, I went to East Berlin through Checkpoint Charlie in that time. And so I had a very vivid memory of Charlottenburg at that time, and then Charlottenburg more recently, which I visited. And so that the West Berlin, plus one of my, I'll call him my great friend Fritz, who's also I've acknowledged as an advisor on German matters. He went to West Berlin because at that time you didn't have to do military service if you went to West Berlin. So he recounted a lot of stories about West Berlin, and I really liked the fact that he sent me a note saying he felt he was back there, back in his old days. And I'll stop right there because then I don't want to get him into trouble. I did a lot of business in Geneva over the years, and in and around Geneva, in places like Zug and in the ski resorts. And I studied in London, knew that really well. And of course, Delhi. And I didn't set out to make these places characters. I just, like everything in the novel, what I tried to do was follow, you know, Hemingway's advice and Scott Fitzgerald's advice, which is once you have your characters feeling real to you, make them do real things and go. And so I just followed the places they would naturally go to. Mm-hmm. And they happened to be these places. And if I didn't know them, then I visited them.
So my next question is about the beautiful cover of the book. Could you tell us about the genesis of that art and also of the title?
Sure. You know, my publisher, Mike Sager, who is a wonderful independent publishing firm and has a wonderful artist on the staff, they were interacting with me on the novel, and I'll come back to the title in a second, but they found this artist, Motoi Yamamoto, mm-hmm. who's a renowned Japanese installation artist, and he does work in salt. And he started working in salt and drawing labyrinths when his sister died. I think she was 24 of brain cancer, and he was distraught. And he found as he drew labyrinths, he could touch at the end of it a memory of her. And he kept doing it to keep a memory of her. And salt is a very, is part of the mourning ceremonies in Japan. It's also to ward off evil spirits. and to bring in benevolent ones. So sumo wrestlers put salt on themselves. There, you have little piles of salt everywhere, and and then Matoy also, what he likes to do is at the end, he takes these huge installations, which are some of the great museums of the world, and he collects them with the public and returns the salt to the sea. So it's
Oh,
kind of a whole cycle of memory and life. So it was his work, and as designed by the Mike Sager's artist. So the cover comes from there, and the title is really from the poetry of W.B. Yeats, specifically the poem 1919. And the metaphors of the labyrinth and the wind, uh, they are common motifs in the poetry of W.B. Yeats. They represent these ungovernable forces, love, passion, nature, uh, change, political change, the carnage and unpredictable nature of revolution. Uh, and so I thought and then the labyrinth, of course, the wind represents this great force of nature, which could be the mad love between the two Ayan has for Gabby. It could also be the destruction that comes from tempests, etc. The labyrinth, of course, could be an inward journey. It has, of course, meanings in Western and Eastern religions, where you come out differently. It could be somebody trapped, and trying to look for a way out. So working, actually, I have to give credit to my wife, who's a W.B. Yeats fan. And working through the poetry of Yeats, we settled on the title which Mike Sager loved. And then his artist got to work. And then she also picked up on my as an author, putting in a lot about mountains.
mhm.
So if you open the book, you'll see drawings of mountains that she did. And so that's the backdrop for the title and the art.
Well, thank you to you and your wife, because that was really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
So the changes ushered in by the Iranian Revolution and Iran's nuclear aspirations are still very relevant in today's geopolitical calculations. Were you at all concerned about writing about those sensitive themes, and how did you weave them throughout the narrative?
Well, you're right that the Iranian Revolution is still relevant because it made political Islam for the first time one of the forms of government. So you had kind of communism, you have capitalism, you had political Islam, and that came directly from the Iranian Revolution, very powerful. And again, the concern, the regional concern, with Iran's influence over through Hezbollah in Syria, Lebanon, in Yemen, is occupying a lot of people, and of course the interactions or lack thereof with Israel. So, so basically, I thought that I was not really concerned really about writing about it, and I was not really. I worried a little about offending Muslim feelings or offending supporters of the Shah. I worried a little bit about that, but I said, why don't I write honestly about the situation and the character? And honestly, I think people have told me that you see both sides. You see what the Shah was trying to do for the country. You see what the dissatisfaction of the Shia population, the dissatisfaction and the hard life they had. And you see people on both sides. So at the end, I was a little concerned with all my Google searches that we would get a dark car outside our house and people wanting my computer, but thankfully nothing of that happened because everyone can see it was for a novel for completely fictional purposes.
I think a lot of writers have that issue, right? Like crime writers who are concerned about like, how do I get rid of a body, being in their Google search.
Exactly.
So the Shah's White Revolution modernization plan, which was encouraged by JFK, ended up being rejected by the Iranian Revolution in Khomeini. Why do you think Iranians rejected modernism in favor of fundamentalist Islam?
Well, you know, that's really sort of it's a tragedy for the Shah, because his goal, it was like a Greek tragedy for him, because he really had an agenda through the White Revolution, which of course Kennedy was pushing, you know, human rights, etc. But he had his own agenda, which was to reduce the power of the landed aristocracy that were opponents of his in Tehran, and also reduce the power of the clergy. And so he basically broke up the big land holdings and wanted to redistribute them to the workers. And he gave voting power to women, and also reduced the power of the clergy in family courts, etc. And thought that he would divide and rule, really, and that he would get huge support from the rural population because they would be landowners, and he gave away shares of corporations to workers and profit sharing to workers, and had these huge infrastructure projects. So a lot of people's standard of living really improved. But, you know, there was not enough trickle down, not much trickle down. So a few people at the top actually got to buy the land that was taken from the landowners. They didn't really go down to the other farmers. Many of them actually ended up being not economic holdings. So they really couldn't sustain themselves through small holdings. And there was a lot of landless laborers who were created, who became some of the principal factors in the revolution. And they had no real love for the Shah. Mm. And then the clergy was extremely upset by the vote to women and the reduction of their power and the daily life of Iranians. And many of the clergy were also part of the aristocracy, the landed aristocracy. So they were personally affected by the redistribution. And so while you had economic progress, it was concentrated in few hands, and people said that's corruption. And the clergy told the population, you know, this guy is immoral and his family is immoral. And then Khomeini in particular, who was the first to speak out after the White Revolution and actually attacked the Shah personally. In the past, the clergy had kept away from politics, but he personally attacked the Shah, for which he was exiled for many years, but he didn't stop. So he kept sending messages, and the people in Iran basically began to believe. He didn't deny when they asked him, are you the Mahdi, which is the Imam coming from occultation, returning, you know, to save Iran. You know, and he did, and he lived the life. So all these, so when you say Iran rejected modernity, the Shah's expatriates and the people who benefited from the Shah's program were a very small, the patina at the top. Just below that was all this roiling dissatisfaction of the landlord, the clergy, the workers who had no land, you know, all the folks who believed that the riches weren't coming down to them. And then you had a couple of organizations, the Fedayeen, who were sort of an Islamic organization, and the Tudeh party, which was really a communist party. So they wanted to get rid of the Shah. And then in the middle, you had Mossadegh, who became a powerful prime minister for a couple of years, who was deposed by the CIA, which, and Iranians never forgot that, but who hated the Shah and diminished the Shah because Mossadegh had blood ties to the Qajar dynasty that the Shah's father overthrew. And he always believed the Shah was a usurper. So you had all these, you had the Fedayeen Islamic party, sometimes supporting the Shah, sometimes pulling away. You had the Tudeh party moving away. You had the clergy against him, and you didn't have enough people with the benefits. So, and then you had Ali Shariati, this wonderfully charismatic, Sorbonne-educated philosopher, who preached a way, and he used to translate Frantz Fanon's books into Farsi. And Sartre is supposed to have said, I don't have a religion, but if I did, it would be that of Shariati, where he showed the way to use true Islam as a force of change and overthrowing this king of kings. So you had really the people at top were just powerless to stop this. And so it was not Iranians that rejected modernity. Iranians rejected all the things that the Shah had done for them that had not worked out the way the Shah had hoped. Mm. It's a long, complicated story, but hopefully people can follow. At the back of the book, I've suggested further reading.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. So I have one more question, and then I think we can move on to some audience questions for the last 15 minutes or so. So if you have any questions that you've been holding on to, now's the time to drop them in the Q&A box. But my last question, kind of circling back to the colonial mindset, the global English-speaking nation state of mind that you were talking about earlier, do you see America as any kind of beacon still in the world, as the lodestar for that cohort?
I think so, because there's really no real competition. We had of course the past 4 years, and they did what they did. But when you look around the world, the reason so many people were disappointed by that was because America and the idea of America, and as I said earlier, you can really choose your part of create your own idea of America. Mm. Is the way to freedom and self-realization, and who doesn't want that? So of course the real power now rising in the world, as everybody knows, is China, but who really wants to live under that rule? So when you think about and then of course Europe, you have the idealism of Europe, and to some extent, Western Europe has picked up the mantle. But they don't have, Western Europe does not have this vision of come here and remake yourself and be yourself. Western Europe is very much about come here and have a great lifestyle, mm-hmm. and be very comfortable and educate yourself very well and live in a very sophisticated, cultured manner. But I'm not sure it sends a message that be whoever you want to be, and you will be assimilated, and you can do whatever you want. And so I think America is still the only place in the world that everybody knows can take in large numbers of people seeking to make of themselves whatever they want. And for that reason, I think it's still the lodestar.
That idea still survives.
I think so.
I think that's beautiful. All right, on to our Q&A. Our first question is from Shanda. Was Gabby real or based on a real person?
Oh, so as I said earlier, the only real people in the book, the parents, the driver, and the Sabak colonel. Everybody else was really based on observing the people around me in Tehran. So as I said, there were all these places. There were these places where people played out their lives. And so Gabby is really sort of a composite of people that I observed during my time in Iran. And I'm glad people think she's a real person. In fact, people are really looking, a lot of people are so enamored of Gabby, they want her phone number. I have to say she's imaginary, I'm afraid.
So Laura would like to know if you would be permitted to do a reading of this novel in a Tehran bookstore today, post-pandemic.
I think most of it I will be, because for the main themes, I think the Iran government will support. It may not be, it may be heavily censored, and obviously it's based on kind of liberal ideas of life. and writing. But I think that's a tough one, because I think that the affair between Ayan and Gabby will not, and the affair between Ayan and Fariba will not be looked on favorably by the Iranian government. But I think the social, economic, the fights for justice, the actions of Ayan, Hamid, most people in the novel who end up fighting and are persecuted, I think they will probably like that. And by the way, I have had several Iranian friends read the novel, not friends who are in Tehran, but friends overseas, and they are very much supportive. But I think finally I'll say probably not. Probably not, because I think it would not meet their standards of social behavior.
Sure. Our next question is from Surab, and they're also very interested in Gabby. It sounds like she is really a fan favorite. Could you talk about the inspiration behind her specifically? And I know that we spoke about observing characters or observing real people to create characters. What kind of people, perhaps, did you observe that became Gabby?
Well, there was several women expatriates, who were very caught up with this Vietnam War, were in America as students, and understood that. And there were people who wanted to change things in their countries. And there were not all European people in India, women in India too, who were partial to the Naxalite movement, the guerrilla movement in India. So she's a composite of kind of the women in India who I met in college, and then the women in London and Europe, who were very sort of not the standard issue, in terms of, I'll just go to college, etc. But they were ones who for them, values mattered more than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And if you had to act, and act now. So I think that I picked that out of different people I observed in many places. And Gabby came together as Ayan's conscience, to remind him about what he should be doing now, as opposed to just thinking about himself,
Mm-hmm.
and showing him what somebody who's willing to risk all, both Hamid and Gabby risk all,
Mm-hmm.
looks like. So I guess that answers the question. I mean, that's the best I can do. But I'm delighted that people think that she's real. That means that a major movie star might take on that role.
I would love to know who you would cast as Gabby.
I was thinking of Charlize Theron maybe a few years ago.
Mm-hmm. She's great. Charlize is great.
I loved her in the last Mad Max movie. I don't know if you saw that.
I saw that 6 times in theaters.
I just love her. So I think she would be the perfect Gabby.
That's a really great
And maybe she was the inspiration, perhaps because I'm such a fan.
Mm-hmm.
She was the inspiration for Gabby.
Nice.
Why not?
So our next audience question is anonymous, but they would like to know, can you share with us how your experiences in Iran at the time of revolution may have shaped your own life?
Well, I think basically whenever I feel relaxed and comfortable with things, I'm reminded of how quickly everything changed. Mm-hmm. How quickly. It was really March of 1978 when a friend of mine in Tehran said to me, "You better get the hell out of here." And I said, "Why?" Because the CIA, everybody was saying, "Hey, this is great. The Shah's in control." Nobody was leaving. And then within a few months, you had all these protests. And this Arba'in is a theme I use in the book, really as a wave, the wave that became so big, cresting every 40 days of mourning, that actually drowned the Pahlavi dynasty. That started picking up steam around me. And again, everybody was denying it. And then suddenly I found that in my company, where we had this very powerful Savak colonel, and the workers never came onto our floors. They were scared to death. They couldn't really strike. If they did, the colonel would call the police, and they would be arrested.
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly, I saw them all over our offices, sort of walking around, workers going around the executive offices, and having a chat and taunting people. So I said, things change so quickly, and against the backdrop of immense institutional power, the Savak, the Shah's armed military, American force, CIA, God knows if MI6 was also there.
Mm-hmm.
You thought this could never happen. These people have nothing besides some tapes coming in from Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly, a few months later, all flights canceled, curfew, etc. So, and then events in the United States the last 4 years have also reminded me of that. So, it's made me a little less comfortable, and whenever I'm comfortable,
Mm-hmm.
It's not that I tell myself become uncomfortable, but I do realize two things: how little I actually know when I think I know a lot, and how little things that are so settled, how unsettled they are below the surface.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it's made me a little bit more anxious, although you'd never believe it. People think I'm a very calm person, but I believe, anyway, that's the best I can answer.
Mm-hmm. Shivani would like to know, did the story unfold as you started writing it, or did you more or less know what was going to happen and how the plot would evolve before writing?
No, the story unfolded. It completely unfolded. Again, I come back to, make real characters do believable things.
Mm-hmm.
And once Ayan, Gabby, Hamid, Nader, the CEO, once they became real and began, and I would go down to my writing room and go into their world, actually. I tried to, and then there's this interplay between choice and circumstance that creates the novel. And of course, there was the chassis of the revolution that gave me the timeline and the dramatic pace.
Mm-hmm.
But within that, all the circumstances, choices, and consequences of people like the people I created the story.
So Ajit says, this book was obviously so well researched in addition to drawing on your own experiences. And their question is, while doing the research for this book, how did your own understanding of the history and culture of Iran evolve compared to how you viewed it from your own personal experience living in Tehran?
Well, that's a wonderful, in fact, a great question, because that's one of the great joys of writing this novel. Because when I was there, I was also truly on the surface of things, like most expatriates. You're there, you're living this privileged life with a group of friends, and time is passing. And around you, not too far outside your villa, you've got real Iran, which you keep at a remove because it's inconvenient to go into it. It's noisy, dusty, sort of complicated. The language is hard. I had a good idea of Iran from our oral tradition. There's a lot of historical interactions and cultural interactions between Iran and India. So I sort of had those preconceived notions. And then I had kind of my notions of living and working there. And then when I started writing this novel, and people would say, what have you been doing all these days? For days, I would be researching something. And it could be Isfahan, which I visited several times. But I would spend a lot of time on the architecture of Isfahan, or some aspect of Shia culture. And so and then or the White Revolution, and understand all these moving forces. I just saw them as one big revolutionary force, and I didn't see all these fragments coming together. I didn't know as much as I know now about this wonderful philosopher, Ali Shariati, who some people say is a Marxist, but he was quite an interesting character. So I've got a much more layered appreciation. The country has really grown even greater in my imagination. And I do wish that over time that we get away from this caricature we have, people yelling death to America, death to so-and-so, and this nuclear issue. I do wish that, because there's it's such an old culture, it's such a deep culture, so accomplished. And there was before the revolution, and there will be for sure sometime sooner than people think, this great interaction between America, Iran, and between the West and Iran. So it's made me much more appreciative of my time there. And it's taught me a lot about India too, given how a lot of Indian culture and Indian language and Indian music, Indian gardens, how much we owe to Iran.
So we have some really wonderful audience questions about craft. So I'm going to squeeze in a few of those before the end of the hour. Let's see. So this one is actually one that I wonder too. TK says, I have a writer friend with whom I have a long-standing argument. If I ask him why he had some character think or do something, he says, that's what they told me. And I insist that he's just creating a mystique around the craft of writing. Do you have characters that surprised you by taking you in directions that you would not have anticipated?
Yes, because, I certainly didn't anticipate that Ayan would actually do what he did and get into the trouble he did, and neither did I realize how dangerous the chances Gabby would take on the ground supporting Baader Meinhof, or how much Hamid would risk his life. So all of this developed over writing the novel as these characters did things that, as their personalities crystallized and their dreams, hopes, ambitions became distinct. And as then they would, and as I figured out what they would likely do in this particular circumstance, I had to figure that out. I use a keyword, figure it out. I didn't plan any of that. I just wanted to get the flesh and blood on these characters. And I knew that the novel would end before the Shah left Iran. And I knew I wanted to start it the day the Iranian Revolution starts, and the protagonist doesn't even know that. It's all day should start like this, he says. He's enjoying whatever he's enjoying, and at the end of that day, he realizes something is changing. But that's all I knew. And I think you should do that. I think if you really want people to believe in your characters, I really think you should first create the characters and then make them do whatever makes sense based on their personality and their dreams and desires. It's got to. Otherwise, you'll have a disconnect, won't you? Bri, I think you would.
Yeah.
Between the action that you're making them take and who they are.
I mean, that's when the reader starts to doubt the book, right? They're like, oh, that character who I know so well would never say this or never do that. So.
And that's one of the great, as people have been reading this book the last few months, that's what makes me happy that some people are not that happy with Ayan's. A lot of people are not that happy with his choices, but nobody says I don't believe him.
Right.
And no one says that I don't believe that there's a person like Gabby's unreal or Hamid would never do that.
All right. Well, unfortunately, it is 5 o'clock, but I'm going to squeeze in one more question if you have time.
Sure, sure I do.
Awesome. Do you have any advice for the several writers in the Q&A who are looking for some advice from somebody who's just finished a novel on how to begin their own?
I do. I would say be brave and go to a writing workshop. Anyone. Just get started. Could it even be for half a day? Which is how I started. I just did a Saturday trip down to Stanford, and that moved into. And I think you have friends like I have a lot of friends from my writing who really shaped this book, and it gives you a lot of confidence because when you start writing, you always feel a little fake. There is the imposter syndrome. There is. And when people read your work and comment on it, you realize it's not fake. It could be improved, and you figure out how to do that. But you realize that what you want to write about means something to people. It's interesting to a lot of people. And the characters you begin to create are fascinating and unknown to a lot of people. And that gives you the confidence to go back and write some more. And also forces you, because of the deadlines, to write more and more. And I think also critiquing other people's work, you get a sense of, with a really good instructor. And that's why I didn't just join any program. I wanted to join a program where they had very serious novelists as instructors. And there was a self-selection of the people who would sign up for these workshops. And you got a lot of the insight from the novelists. And to me, I remember walking out of Stanford to my car, and I was walking with Lynn Stegner. And she was Wallace Stegner's daughter-in-law, and she's a well-known writer, published many novels. And she just said to me, "Madhav, this is going to be a big book." And that was so inspiring to me because it's still early stages. So I think that you will always find they know how to make you feel that way. So that would be my advice.
I'm signing up for a writer's workshop. You sold me.
Okay, but before you go, can I give a little shout out to your wonderful bookstore?
Oh, thank you. Of course.
I do want everybody here to know that I'm so thrilled to be hosted by not just Boston and Brookline's treasure, the busiest place in the community, which has been there since 1961. It's not only famous locally, it's one of the top 10 bookstores in the United States. And I'm so privileged to be hosted by them. They have to fight against all sorts of corporate demands and competitors. So I do hope you'd buy your books order your books from Booksmith, Brookline Booksmith, and attend their award-winning events.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bree.
And I am going to drop a link to where you can purchase Labyrinth of the Wind on brooklinebooksmith.com in the chat. So there we go. Madhav, before I let you go, are you working on anything else? What can we look forward to?
I'm beginning to work on a novel thriller set, a financial thriller set really in New York and San Francisco. So it's the early stages. And I guess that's where I am. I'm trying to develop a few characters. As I said, I won't be able to go forward until I get 2 or 3 main characters.
Well, let me know when it's finished because I would love to chat again when that one's being published.
Thank you, Bree.
Of course. And thank you so much to everyone in our audience for the amazing questions. To find more of our events, you can find us at brooklinebooksmith.com/events. And of course, you have the link to Labyrinth of the Wind, which I'm so excited to read. Thank you, Madhav.
Bye-bye.